Hello guys, my name is Augusto. I'm MCVPOD in AIESEC in Brazil, and I'm doing this video to explain you a little bit about our OD model because lots of people are asking me about this for the applications for MC around the world, and also because we just refreshed our OD model, so I think it would be very interesting to share it with you guys a little bit. All right. So for that, I will explain a little bit of what was our OD model in the past semester, on the last semester, and then I'll explain what were the conclusions that we had and the analysis that we did to create the new OD model, and then the final version of it that we are still working on and implementing here in AIESEC in Brazil. All right. So the first thing that we talk about our OD model here in Brazil is always start with the why. So why do we have our organization development model? We use it to clarify the path that will drive AIESEC in Brazil to grow sustainably. So we show this path both for the local committees, but also for AIESEC in Brazil as a network on what is the role of each entity and how they are going to grow sustainably, not only in operations but also in organizational health. All right. So we have 3 points here. It's clarify the path. So we use concepts based on the environment that we are placed. We have the second part, which is grow. We develop strategies that guide that guide us to grow higher than the organic expectation, which is around 20% every year. The organic expectation, and we want our entities to grow more than that. And sustainably, we are aligning processes, structure, leadership, culture, and goals for each one of the entities based on this OD model, right? We have a theory basis, which is the Good to Great, a book from Jim Collins. Actually, we just take one part of it, which is the hedgehog concept, which tell us that there are 3 things that a organization must understand to find its best product or its best service that will drive this entity to grow, to stop being good to become excellent or good to great, right? So the first thing is what ignites the organizational motor of your organization. For an enterprise is what will bring more money, but for AIESEC is what will bring more exchanges, right? What arouses the passion of this organization? So basically, what drives the organizational culture of this entity, and in the case of local committees, is what culture is built around the operations, and what you could be the best at in the world. So for that, you have to analyze very carefully the market in which you are placed in, to understand if I have a small market, for example, for startups, it's very hard for me to be the best one in the world for IGE. So it shouldn't be my focus. This theory that we are using is basically to drive specialization of the entities and choose 1 or 2 operations that will drive the growth of this entity, right? So this is Good to Great. And we talk about 3 steps around organizational development here in AIESEC in Brazil. First is the OD model itself, which is the context that we are placed in. So we look at the national entity, how is the big picture of it, and then we establish ambition. So for example, last year we had the ambition to have 10 LCs in 2 LCs in top 10 in each operation. This is the first ambition. The second ambition, we wanted 75% of all our entities to be full member in our criteria here, national criteria. And the last one, we wanted that 100% so all of our entities to achieve at least 50% of their planning. So these were our ambitions that were driving both the small entities, the middle entities, and the biggest entities of AIESEC in Brazil. We have the growth model, which are the frameworks and strategies that we built for each of the the areas that a local committee has. So for all the operations and for TM, finance, we had marketing. Now we don't have, but we had the growth model for that, which were the strategies for each one of the steps that this area has for their growth. So I will explain this later, and then I think we'll clarify. And the last part was the last step was the implementation channels, which were used to communicate both the OD model and the growth model, so we can implement this with the LCs to drive their growth, to grow sustainably. What are the implementation channels? The conferences, summits, we have visits, we have the chairs. So when the MC is chairing a local conference, or even the virtual chats that we do with the VPs or with the LCPs, these are the implementation channels that we have. So we have these 3 steps for the organizational development in AIESEC in Brazil, and we try to establish as clear as possible each one of them. And I'll try to explain you guys during this video. So for the OD model itself, we used to clusterize our entities, and then it was building our growth model. So how do we do that? We had network tiers that were telling us the maturity of that area, the area maturity, and we have a tier 1 until 6, and there was a tier attention. What was this tier attention? Was the tier that did less than the minimum that we believed that was required for that operation. I'll show you later. And then we have the entities clusters, which were telling us the entity maturity. So we had cluster 1 until cluster 6. The cluster 1 was the best one. Cluster 6 were our smaller entities. And how did we do that? Looking at the network tiers, and then there was a combination for that to build the entities clusters. I'll clarify that for you guys. So how do we do that? As I was telling, there was a criteria for operation, so the operational tiers, and organizational health criteria, which was only finance, because it was the only data that we had back then. So for example, this is about the growth model, all right? So we had the operational tiers from tier 6 to 1 and the tier attention, and then we had goals for each one of these tiers. So for these goals were for the year. So if a VP wanted his area in IGV to be in tier 3, for example, he had to do 150 approved in that year, in the last 12 months, from January to December, or from July to June. We did this clustering every January or every December and every July in our biggest conferences. If a VP wanted to be in tier 1 and he was only one VP, he had to do 250 approved in that year. Or there are some LCs that had 2 VPs, they had to do 300 approved in that year. And the tier attention, as I was mentioning, was a minimum that he had to achieve in the semester. So it was the minimum required for that, because then we were closing operations or closing the LC itself, because he was not achieving the minimum that our network requires. So for example, for IGV, it was 19 approved in one semester. And for each one of these tiers, then we were creating strategies, the frameworks to work. And so you knew the step by step you had to do to jump from one tier to another. So I'll give you an example. For IGV, sorry, it's IDCDP here, I didn't updated this. But we had the structure recommended, so 1 VP, 4 PMs, and 12 TMP, 12 members for tier 2, sorry. So if you were in tier 2, this was the recommendation for your structure, this was the productivity recommended for you. These were the operational strategy recommended for you. This was the goal for you to move for tier 1, so you had to do 250 approveds in 1 year. These were the recommendations in terms of IR and international relations, and in terms of education. And you would probably have the expectations for your semester around 90 and 129 approveds. So this mainly was your goal for that semester. You had a specific goal, but then all the entities that were in tier 2 in IGV had these expectations around 90 and 129. All right, so this is the growth model that we had, and then combining these tiers, we would build the cluster together with the finance criteria. Here is an abstract just for you to understand a little bit. For example, if you wanted to be in cluster 2, then you need to have 2 tiers, 2 operations in tier 1. Besides that, you needed to have a monthly turnover of 20,000 reais, working capital of 14,000 reais, and a financial reserve of 12,000 reais. You had to pay if you had any debt with the MC, you had to pay 100% of this plan every month, and you have to have the account statement all done every month, which is the money that the LCs are sending the MC for each operations that they are doing, or anything that they are paying for the MC. And sometimes they are not paying. So if they are not fulfilling these criteria, they are going down to another cluster. So financial or organizational health criteria was only happening after cluster 3. So for cluster 3, cluster 2, and cluster 1. All right? And then you had the combinations, which are more visual over here for you guys. This is the old one. We had a lot of problems here because it wasn't very logic. So this is one of the problems that we faced in the old model. And the other criteria was the organizational health criteria. So you can see each one of the clusters, which were the finance criteria that you should fulfill. For example, cluster 1, 35,000 monthly turnover, 18,000 working capital, 25,000 financial reserve, and you couldn't have any debt with the MC. So this was the old one. We faced a few problems with that and a few challenges, and we were rethinking what we wanted to do. But still, the why was the same one. So clarify the path to grow sustainably. And then we also had this, but then we went deeper to understand how exactly the MC could work with the LCs, with this OD model, so we can enhance this growth of the LCs. So we found 3 steps. The first is diagnosis, so understanding at the MC level, looking at the entities, the local entities. Where is your entity? What are your strengths and weaknesses in organizational health and in operations? Understanding exactly what is that entity and where it is. So the second step was to group. So grouping these entities, what are the entities with similar situations? So it refers, for example, for the old tiers on the old clusters that we had. And then we go to support, which is after we understand the diagnosis and we group correctly, then what are the recommendations for this group of entities or for this specific entity based on the diagnosis that we had. So this is the MC or the OD team and the NSTs looking at the entities and working with them, doing diagnosis, grouping, and support. If I'm a LCP or a VP or someone at the local level, then I would look at this model and try to do 3 things. Diagnosis, where is my entity, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, and then we would go to references. Which are the entities we can learn with, which are the entities we can contribute with. So in every aspect, and it has to be very specific. So I'm very good at operations, but what is specifically in that operation? I'm very good in organizational health, but in what is exactly? And what are the other entities teaching me that can enhance my performance? And then I would go to support to answer these questions. Where can I find the support I need? So not always I have to go to the MC, because I can look out for other LCs that can teach me what I need. What are the questions I need to answer? So basically, after I know the diagnosis, I don't go with open and wide questions to search for support, but I know exactly what I need, and then maybe the MC has the answer, or maybe I have to co-create this. So this is the last question. How do I apply or co-create the strategies I need? This is in the part of support, the LC level thinking about the OD model. If we had these three steps in the previous model, we would have some challenges. So let's look out at the challenges. The first thing is the diagnosis. We didn't have it because we only had how many approveds did the LC deliver, and how much money did it have. Grouping doesn't reflect the entity's realities, and the references are not clear in the past OD model. And the support, we couldn't give a proper support for the entities because our diagnosis, our grouping, and our references were failing. So these were the challenges that we looked at the old model and understood. So then, if we look at the older steps that I already explained you guys, we also have a few challenges. So let's look at the challenges. The first challenge, we used to establish ambitions for the entities. So if we had closed, established numbers for the tiers and the clusters, the LCs were just choosing from a variety of numbers, which was their ambition or their goal, because they had 250 for tier 1 in IGV, and then they chose to be tier 1 in IGV for that year. And then we asked, why do you want to be tier 1 in IGV? And then they didn't have any answer. They just chose from a menu. Oh, this is cool, I want to be in tier 1, so 250 is nice. And that also worked out with clusters. Oh, I want to be cluster 2, or I want to be cluster 1. Why? Oh, because then I'll be recognized, or then I'll have the status in the national plenary. This is a problem for us. We don't work with the complexity of an entity because both in operations and in organizational health, we were looking at just a couple of criteria or a couple of elements. The growth model was just looking at the number of attraction consideration that we were doing, meaning the number of approveds that an entity was delivering, which doesn't actually mean that that operation is healthy or is good, because there are all another plenty of criteria that we use to should look at to understand if our operation is good or not. And the implementation channels were failing because we didn't know what to give or what to co-create, because the diagnoses were failing, the grouping was failing, and everything. So these were the challenges. When we looked at the theory basis, it was basically to guarantee the entity's specialization, right? But then if we look at the old OD model, it doesn't value specialization. An entity could evolve in the model without evolving the focus operation. So, for example, to be in cluster 2, an entity should have 2 operations in tier 1, but it didn't need to be the focus operation. So what happened in practice was that a few entities in the willing to be in cluster 2, for example, were focusing the last month in another operation that wasn't the focus, because this operation would bring them to cluster one, and then they were failing to work with the specialization of their entity. So this was another challenge. So let's take an overview around the model and what we realized about it. First, as AIESEC in Brazil, we want an ambition, or the three ambitions that I told you. So we want our entity to grow together, to grow both the small entities, the medium entities, the high volume entities, but each entity must have its own ambition, meaning they have to understand where they are, do a historical analysis, understand their market, understand their possibilities, their resources, and then create their ambition based on that. Not choosing an ambition in a variety of options that we provided them. When we talk about grouping, it should be more realistic, understanding the complexity of an entity. The references should be clear, so I should look at the OD model and understand exactly who is good in what and what I'm good at that I can teach the network. The growth model should consider other aspects besides approved, as I told you. The implementation channels can only evolve if we evolve the diagnosis and the grouping and references. The diagnosis must evolve so we can really understand our entities and provide a good support. And when we talk about the OD model, it must evolve to really consider organizational health and operations in its complexity. So this is basically a basic overview that we had, and then we built another OD model based on these conclusions, and understanding that we wanted the best support for the entities so we can drive them to grow, not exactly the driving ambition through the OD model, but driving growth through the OD model, driving management, understanding where we are failing, where we are doing good, and then driving this sustainable growth. So let's take a look at it. When we talk about the growth model, we created an index. So there is this global operation index, which tells us the operation maturity of each of the operations of an LC, but also the operation maturity of that entity. So we did some math with the average of every operation index of every operation, but then the focus area it, it has more value in this average stuff. Sorry about my English right now. I don't know these terms, but let's go. So every entity will receive a score from 0 to 10, being 10 the best operation in AIESEC in Brazil, and 0 the worst one, probably if they don't do anything. That's it, the 0. So how do we get to this index? We dreamed a little bit of what were the criteria that we wanted to evaluate, but we have a few problems today in AIESEC in Brazil that we don't have the data. But we know that until at least June we will have this data, and then we work with the evolution of this index. So ideally, we would look at the opens of IG and IGT, we would look at the approveds, we would look at the realizations, at the complete, at the NPS of this entity, of this operation of a specific entity. Today, the only two data that we have that are trusty are approved and realized. So we did a simple math with that, as you can see here. The score is the number of approved for the historic record times 10, which means that if you have the historic record in approved, you are score 10. In the same way, realization. So we do an average between approved and realization, and then you have your score. So for example, the score 10 for OGV in AIESEC in Brazil is AIESEC in Brasilia in the year of 2016. They did 339 approvals. Every entity that is lower than that goes decreasing the score until zero. And the realization is AIESEC in Rio de Janeiro, that did 139 realizations in 2014. So this is the score 10 in realization. So every entity will look at their scores, and then there will be a major score for that specific operation, and then a major score for the whole operation of their entity. Basically, if you have a, for example, if you have, let's see if I can explain this in English. So if you have 4 operations in your entity, then you are adding the 2 focus area again, meaning counting as if you had 6 operations, because the focus area are counting twice, and then you divide that for 6, and then you have the average score, right? So this is the idea. Later we'll have the Google Sheets where you guys can look at the formulas and all the criteria that are explained there as well. So here is just more like a big picture for you to understand, all right? And then we created a global health index which scores the organizational health for each entity, scoring from 0 to 10. And this one is a little more complex. We already have more data, and then I'll explain for you. We have 4 pillars. So finance, membership, audit, and achievement. And in each of these pillars, we have some criteria. So for example, in finance, we have cash, the MC debt that the LC has, the MC payment, so that money that they have to send us every month for their operations, and the finance audit, if they have all the documents that prove their money flow, their cash flow. In membership, we have integrated experience. So how many members in that LC already did exchange? How many people in that LC had national roles? How many of them went to national conferences, and what was their retention? Just a note that all of these criteria, both in the Global Operation Index and in the Global Health Index, they are evaluating 1 year, so 12 months of their entity, all right? So we look, for example, in national roles, how many national roles that entity had in the last 12 months, all right? Audit. So we look at the contracts, the operation quality audit, the legal audits, the terms for volunteering. So every member in AIESEC in Brazil has to sign a volunteer term so we can be legal. And we audit all of these things. We have a national audit team that does this job for us. And the last one is achievement, which is operational achievement. It is not it's not counting operations twice, because we already have the global operation index, right? The global operation index is looking at how good you are in that operation. If you are looking at achievement, you're just looking if that entity is healthy in terms of achievement, because they are fulfilling their promise. So for example, you can have a very good operation, which meaning that you deliver a lot of exchanges, but poor achievement, meaning that you're not achieving your planning. And the other way around is also possible. So an entity that delivers just a little bit of exchanges, but they are very healthy because they are achieving all of their planning and all what they are promising. All right. So the score is very simple in these terms, but there are lots of math in this, all of the criteria. But in the pillars, we just look at the average score of each one of the pillars. Again, I will share with you guys the sheets that we have that are explaining all of the criteria and how we calculate what are the parameters that we use. So we created it all with the specific MCVP that are responsible for each one of the areas. All right? But the important thing is that we go out with a score after that. So when we cross the global health index and the global operation index, then we have the new OD model, which is a global committee index, looking at the whole committee in its organizational health and in its operation maturity. We have this Cartesian coordinate graph where we have this axis, which is the GHI from 0 to 10 and the GOI from 0 to 10 as well. And then we locate the entities in this graph. So for example, this LC YY is very bad in health, but it's very bad in operations as well. This AIESEC TT, they are very good at operations and very good at health. But this entity at RR is very good at health, but it's not very good at operations. So when we locate the entities here, we know exactly with what kind of support we must give them. And when we look, for example, at the Global Health Index, we can have a very a more precise diagnosis for to say. So if I know my score and I know which pillar has the highest or the lowest score, I know where to focus. So for example, if I have a general score in my GHI of 8, but I see that my finance is scoring just 4, I know that this is pulling my score down. And then I look at the specific criteria, which one of them I'm not fulfilling. So I know in my management what should be my focus in the next months, right? So this is how we thought about diagnosis and giving a better support for the entities. So when we look at the graph, this is the theory, but this is the practice that we built. So we have 51 entities in AIESEC in Brazil, and each one of these dots are one of our LCs, right? So for example, this LC is the best one in health. This is AIESEC in Natal. This is our best LC in operations. This is AIESEC in Belo Horizonte. But then I understand where is my LC and what should be the role of my term or my support as MC, for example, for each one of these entities. And me as LCP or as VP, I also can understand how am I related to my network. So how did we do the part of grouping and references, especially grouping? So if we look at the Global Operation Index, we just created the best division for support based on the scores. So for example, in OGV, we have all 51 entities working with OGV. And we have 7 NSTs that are consultants that are working with these entities. So with this, I can just put 7 entities for each one of the 7 NSTs to work, and this is the best support because everyone is taking care of the same amount of entities. Because before, when I had the specific goal for each of the tiers, I had, for example, 2 entities in tier 1, 15 entities in tier 2, and it was very hard to divide to give support for these entities. This is an arbitrary methodology, for to say, but it provides a better support for the entities. And when we look at the clusters that we had previously, which were the combinations of tiers and finance criteria, right now we look at the graph and we just create the best division for support based on the graph. So it is also arbitrary, we can cut the graph as we would like to create the grouping that we wanted. So this time we created the following division. So the first cut we did for operations, so this horizontal cut, and we had a lot of entities that had low performance in terms of operations, but then we cut this in 3 groups. So this group has low health and low operations. This has low operations and middle health, and this has high health and low operations, right? This is the second cut, the other cut, the last cut that we did. So we had a variety of entities in terms of health, but they are all in the same level of operation, in the middle level. And then we have the last one, which are the entities that have a high operation volume, but a variety of health realities. Why did we cut like that? Because we are 5 people in the audit team here in AIESEC in Brazil, and then we wanted to create clusters with around 10 entities, and this was the best division that we found for that. But we can cut as we like to give the best support and understand which kind of support we want to provide for those entities. All right, so I think this is it. There are plenty of other things and specific criteria that I didn't explain how the math works, especially in Global Health Index, but the sheets will be available for you. We don't have the explanation very deeply yet, but we are creating a website for that, as we had for the previous one. But since it's a very new OD model, we don't have all the material. That's why I decided to record this video for you. But I will provide a online form so you can send your questions about it. So maybe I'll do some frequent asked questions, or maybe record another video for you guys to understand better about this. All right, so I hope it was helpful for you. I'm sorry it was a long video, but here it is. See you later, guys.